Hello, everyone. Welcome to School After Hours podcast, where staff, administrators, and families keep their finger on the pulse of the wonderful world of OST programming, aka out of school time programming. I am your host, Jay Lee, and today we have the wonderful Miss Yolanda Hall on the show with us. She is a youth life coach and the founder of Unbreakable Minds. Unbreakable Minds is an organization that provides life coaching services to teens and young adults in the Richmond area and surrounding counties. So, the reason why I have Miss Yolanda on the show today is that we are going to talk about a very important topic. That topic is trauma-informed care. I know as we deal with children coming from different life circumstances and different backgrounds, we're not often educated about trauma and the effects that it has on these children, not just on the kids, but also the families as well. So I thought it would be a good idea to invite Miss Yolanda in and have this sit-down conversation with her, but also get some strategies from her about mindfulness as well and how she uses mindfulness with the young people that she coaches. Without further ado, let's jump into our Community Corner. Community Corner is a segment of the show that allows guests or myself to share tips, advice, or information with families, youth, and community members. So for today's Community Corner, I asked Ms. Yolanda, what are some things that people should keep in mind when thinking about trauma-informed care? Here was her response.
So just a little bit of information about trauma. We want to make sure that everybody understands what trauma is first and foremost. And so trauma involves direct or indirect exposure to adverse events or experiences, right? So these experiences may be perceived as life-threatening or dangerous, and it brings with it high levels of stress that can overwhelm a person's ability to cope. And so trauma can be acute, meaning that it's sudden or unexpected experience, like a loss of a job or a loss of a loved one. Or it could be chronic, meaning that it's long-term and ongoing and just intense, like maybe abuse or neglect. And so both forms have similar effects physically, mentally, and emotionally. Trauma has no boundaries, right? So when it comes to age, gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, social orientation, none of that stuff matters. Everyone is at risk of experiencing trauma. And so once someone experiences trauma, it elicits a stress response. And so during that time, those stress hormones that we talk about, those are released. So cortisol, adrenaline, right? So you might have an increased heart rate, pupils dilating, airways are open, so you can fight, flight, or freeze, right? You know, we talk about fight, flight, freeze all the time when we get into traumatic type experiences. And so if it's like really intense and frequent and prolonged, it can become toxic. And that's where we get the term toxic stress. So we want to make sure we figure out some ways to counteract toxic stress so it doesn't have negative impacts on our lives. And so when we're addressing trauma, we have to make sure we come from a trauma-informed lens. And that means educating the public, making sure the public is aware of trauma and its impacts, that we talk about prevention and early intervention, and that we do trauma-informed assessments and treatment.
Thank you, Miss Yolanda, for sharing all that good information with us. So we're going to go ahead and skip along into our interview. Here we go. So once again, thank you for being here with me, Miss Yolanda. I'm so happy to have you.
Nice. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. Love talking about out of school time, after school programs, and all those great resources that we have for kids.
Right.
I love it.
Right. I remember going through an experience with youth that had experienced trauma and getting my first training through Child Savers and not knowing and being aware of how it can impact the person's mind, but also emotions and reactions. It was very, very shocking. And it made me more understanding of some of the things that I was going through in the space. But also it made me realize that, you know, trauma-informed care is not something that we often have like serious conversations about, but not just serious conversations, also plans for.
Right. You're absolutely correct.
So hopefully when we dive into this conversation, we can pull out some of them answers from you, ma'am.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. So Miss Yolanda, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in youth development and OST programming.
Right, sure. So I grew up in Queens, New York, right? Just to give you a little bit of history. And I attended Catholic school like first through 12th grade. So I guess I
Mm-hmm.
would be considered kind of sheltered. In New York, most people go to PS, whatever.
Public school is something different, y'all. Something different.
Yes, public school is something different, and I never got the experience. So I'm like, okay, did my little, in New York, it's like the good schools, quote unquote, and I'm like, okay, whatever. But I'm missing out on a lot here. But I grew up in a single parent household. My father passed away when I was like 2 months old. And so my mother was a single mom, a widow early in her life. And so she heavily, heavily depended on the village. And so during high school, I excelled, all attention with all eyes on me. So I excelled, I did well, but my family didn't know what they didn't know. I kind of had to find my way. So I left New York, I came to college, and I went to Virginia Union, and then I transferred to VCU, and I got my bachelor's and my master's degree there. And I just knew that I wanted to help young people whose families don't know what they don't know, like mine, to help them find their way, right? As a unit, just to help them find their way. And so I began to think about my school counselor. My school counselor was the bomb, y'all, when I was in high school. And so she helped me navigate through school and through life. And I was like, you know what? That's what I want to do. So I started my professional career as a school counselor, and I served as a school counselor in the middle school and high school levels for 15 years. And I, like you said, I witnessed a lot of children who had experienced trauma. It was evident in their behavior with the stories that you hear from their parents and things like that. I worked in traditional schools, I worked in non-traditional schools, and then I worked in military schools, schools for military dependent children. So you can imagine the levels of trauma, that they have been experiencing. So after that 15 years, I transitioned over to the local mental health agency. And so I'm a prevention specialist, and I work with youth, families, and communities efforts to educate and bring awareness of the impact of having high risk factors, right? And so we want to decrease those risk factors and increase protective factors. That's
Right.
a big part of what I do. And then within the past year, I just began to think, how can I do more? And so I recognized the need to assist youth who show great potential, but they need to get out of their own head, get out of their own way, so that they can live their best life with purpose, on purpose. So I started Unbreakable Minds Youth Life Coaching. And really quick there, I consider myself a safe space creator, because when you're talking about working with children who've had these experiences and you're just not sure how they're going to show up. They come to your program, they enroll, but you never know what to expect. So I just made it my goal to create safe spaces for young people. And I rely heavily on connection and relationships to create the environment for transformation to take place. And so they feel seen and heard and validated. Like, that's what we want at the core. And so I help them clear a path to their greatness and support them on a journey of their own truth, to learn how to communicate so people will listen, to get clear on what they're passionate about, and set goals and clear action plans. And so I helped them realize that everything that they were searching for, that they have within them. Again, I just wanted to be that person that I needed in my life. I work with young people ages 15 to 25. And so those were those years that were kind of rough for me. So I just want to be that person that I needed for young people today.
And in your line of work of what you do through your program, Unbreakable Minds, how do you see trauma affecting youth today?
When you talk about youth, a lot of times the things that are happening are things that they have no control over. So something may be going on with their parents, something may be going on with their family. Right now, we're still in the pandemic. Young people are experiencing loss. They're experiencing isolation, loneliness. And so no one could have predicted this, but young people, their minds and bodies are still developing. As things are happening, this is something that could impact them long term for the rest of their lives. So outside of what comes from just family type trauma, Now we're dealing with something that's impacting the whole world. They're
Mhm.
going through a lot, but I see the transition happening now that they're back in school and they can engage in their social
Mhm.
activities a little bit more. So that's been really good when it comes to their trauma experiences and lowering, again, those risk factors and increasing those protective factors.
In talking about those protective factors in organizations, how do you begin to identify as a professional in the OST space, someone that may be experiencing trauma? What certain things should you look out for? And then how do you begin to go through the process of helping? Because we're not professionals in that sense of we're mandated reporters, where
Right,
if we notice something that we have to say something, of course,
right.
for the protection of the child. But when you see that child struggling with something and it may be related to a certain level of trauma, how do you, as a provider, then begin to set up, let me say, preventive measures for that child?
So when you talk about how does like what are some telltale signs or how does that behavior look, right? We talked
Mm-hmm.
about when young people or anybody's experiencing trauma that they may go into fight, flight, or freeze. And the way that
Mm-hmm.
looks, like for fight, usually that means that the person is moving towards what feels threatening. And so they
Mm-hmm.
may show up aggressive. They may be like yelling and screaming at you or using mean words when they communicate with their peers, even hitting, kicking, biting, throwing things, any of those type of things. They may be defensive. You know, they don't want to take responsibility for their behavior. I know this term oppositional defiant comes up, and that may
Mm-hmm.
be a stress
Oh,
response.
please go into that.
Listen,
Please
right?
go into that.
Yeah,
Please.
yeah, and so they just look like they're non-compliant when in actuality they just may be having a stress response to a situation that's going on. Something that to the naked eye doesn't appear to be threatening, but depending on the
Mm-hmm.
experiences they've had as a young person, I always talk about somebody like in schools I see, they looked at me, right? And you're like, okay, so they looked at you. But listen, if it appears to be a threat, then I'm gonna come for you and get you before you get me, right? So
Right.
that's how it may show up in a fight state or in a flight state. That's when the young person wants to move away from what feels threatening. So that
Mm-hmm.
may look like being unfocused, having a hard time paying attention. They may be fidgety, restless, or hyperactive. They may be preoccupied or busy doing everything except for what you want them to do, what they're supposed to be doing right now. They
Mm-hmm.
may avoid things or just kind of ignore the situation. So that's how it looks in the flight state. And then when we talk about
Mm-hmm.
freeze, it's kind of like something is happening. I feel threatened and I am like unable to move. I'm just stuck, and that's something that you see and you're asking questions, you're asking them to do something and they're not responsive. And you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out what's going on, but not remembering in the back of your mind that it's a possible reaction to their stress being activated. And so under freeze,
Mm-hmm.
it may look like shutting down, their mind goes blank. They may say, I don't know. You ask them a question that they know, but they say,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, right? Or either they're just verbally unresponsive. Sometimes we look at those behaviors and think that young people are being intentional about just being defiant or not wanting to comply. But a lot of times we have to step back and think this might be a stress response and respond a little bit differently. And so when you talk about being proactive and being preventive, number one is making sure that you doing that personal and professional development and learning about trauma and what it looks like, right? So
Mm-hmm.
make sure that we're training our professionals to recognize the signs and then to know how to respond instead of react. Because at the end of the day, the professionals also have to think about their own trauma response. So if I'm at my program and something that a child is doing is triggering me, then I have to be aware of my own triggers and be mindful and present and in the moment and just stop and say, okay, wait a minute. I can't react to this situation. I have to respond and then be
Right.
able to model that for the young people when they're experiencing it as
Mm-hmm.
well. So, and
Mm-hmm.
then just having conversations about it because sometimes young people are not having these conversations in their homes, right? Parents are not
You are
saying,
right.
hey, let's talk about this trauma and how we're going to act when we go out.
You preaching it, yes.
Listen, listen. So, in my program, I make it a part of my daily routine to do mindfulness activities with the kids and just teach them how to self-regulate. And so when they're at a time when they're getting anxious or they sense a threat or they feel those physiological things that are going on in their body, that they can stop and say, okay, I feel myself getting ready to jump out of character. Let me back up, be present, take a minute, breathe. You know what I mean? And
Right.
so all those things have a great effect on just the environment. And again, at the end of the day, safety and survival is at the core of everything. And if that feels threatening,
Yes.
that's what you're going to see. That's what you're going to see.
hmm
Yeah.
hmm And I'm so happy that you bring it up as far as being aware of your own triggers as a professional, because you come into this field, or any field rather, with what you know and what you've experienced.
Right.
So we come to every situation with our own level of baggage, our own level of trauma, let me say. And if you are unaware of it, you may have a hard time checking yourself to, like
Right.
you said, model the behavior that you want to see. And I know for me, it was a case of, ooh, this child right
Right.
here, help me.
Right.
Because
Right.
you go for what you want. Because in dealing with the situation of what went on in my household, like, this is how I know to handle a situation, because this is what I've seen in my household for as far as comfort and conflict. You have to take yourself outside of that, because that's what you know, and
Right.
put yourself more in the sense of, as a professional and as a
Mm-hmm.
model, how do I need to go ahead and handle this situation for this child, because they may be up here at level 10 and I
Right.
need them to come down to more like a 6.
Right. And I can't be on a 10 trying to get them down to a level
Right,
6 if I can't get there, right?
right. Exactly. Like, we gonna be going at it. We gonna be going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and that's not what you want to do, and that's not where you want to be. It's not. It don't end up good for anybody at that point.
Right. Right.
So being mindful that the child's response is a response out of emotion,
Right.
but it could be coming out of a place of fear, or, like you said, a threat.
Mm-hmm.
So they feel like they got to turn all the way up to level 10, 25 to
Right.
let you know that they serious and not having it. But like you said, creating that safe space for them to have them realize, you know what, I'm not here to hurt you. I'm
Right.
not here to bring you down as a human being or as a person. I
Absolutely.
understand that in this moment that you are upset and you are frustrated. You might be very angry, and I get
Mm-hmm.
it. You
Mm-hmm.
may have every right and every reason to be angry, but there are some other options, and giving them options that you can express that emotion. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those options.
Absolutely. And I always talk about you have to stay ready so you don't have to get ready, right? So when you plan these things ahead of time and have these conversations with young people, then when they're in the moment, then it's easier to talk to them and to remind them of the strategies that you've been teaching all along. When you make that a
hmm
norm or a standard in your program, that we're going to talk about this so that when the time comes up, we're ready. So we don't have to get ready, right?
hmm
And then
Right.
you kind of set the stage or set the environment for this person to
hmm
be able to kind of, like you said, come down from that 10 a little bit easier.
hmm
And there's something called co-regulation. So if I come there and I'm coming down and I'm calming and I bring that energy into the room, then the young person can play off my energy. And so now we're kind of coming down together. And so that is an
hmm
awesome experience. Yeah.
And Miss Yolanda, what should those conversations sound and look like when they are talking to their students about regulating their emotions and their feelings when they're at, like, extreme highs?
Right. So when we're talking ahead of time and we're training young people to understand what's happening with their mind and their bodies when they're experiencing trauma,
hmm
we help them be
hmm
able to recognize the signs themselves. So just to be able to talk
hmm
about sitting in the moment and recognizing what my body is doing when I am stressed, right? So we have those
mm
conversations so that if my heart racing or me getting sweaty or my fist clenched or any of those kind of things, if we know ahead of time that that is a sign that we're being triggered or something like that, then
hmm
my heart starts to race and my fist starts to clench and all these things happen,
hmm
If I sit back, then I can say, oh, okay, I'm experiencing some triggers. I've been triggered and I
Mhm.
need to intervene now, right? Because I want
Right.
this to be a positive experience.
Mhm.
So creating that safe space for them to be able to be okay doing that. And you're not looking at them as a professional, like, what is wrong with you? Because, like what you were saying earlier, we'll give them that look or say, what is wrong with them? What is wrong with you? But when you are looking through a trauma informed lens, then you can go from asking the question, what's wrong with you, to, I wonder
Mhm.
what happened to this person
Right.
that causes them to respond this way. So when we're
Mhm.
having those conversations, we're just coming to this young person, and number one, using silence is okay. Let's just sit here. I'll sit here with you. Don't try to ask someone questions about why they did something when they're in the thick of the moment and they're still on 10, right? So sometimes just sitting
Mhm.
here in the space, being supportive and just being here, is the start
Mhm.
of that de-escalation. And then opening conversations with them by just asking them, what is it that you need right now? Because sometimes we jump in and we want to do what we think they need and all these other things. And sometimes that could exacerbate the situation or increase the
Mhm.
traumatic response. Whereas if I ask you and I sit in silence and wait, then you can tell me what you need and I can see if
Mhm.
that's something that I can do or can get for you. Sometimes it's
Mhm.
space, sometimes they want to talk, sometimes they don't want to talk. Having a space in your program or your facility where someone can go and get away from the crowd, that's a good practice to have in place. Like a mindfulness corner or a chill out corner or something like that. And then having
Support the
some,
chill out corner. Get a
yeah,
little fidget.
listen, having some little things for them to manipulate over there, Okay, I'm gonna give you a couple of minutes. You let me know when you're ready, then we can come back and talk. So having those conversations when they're at a place that they can access that prefrontal cortex, right? And so they can
Right.
they can
Right.
be a little more rational versus being
Right.
in survival mode and nothing you say is going to help them regulate themselves. So yeah.
Right. At that point, they are not trying to hear you.
Yeah,
It is
they're
all
done.
going in one ear and out the other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're like, not a good time.
Mm-mm, not right now. Mm-mm, no, ma'am, not right now. Just give me a
hmm
couple minutes. Not right now.
hmm
Oh boy. And I
Yes.
remember having this experience with this one child, and I just, for the life of me, could not understand why they would go from 0 to 60. All of certain situations, and it wasn't because of everything.
hmm
It was more so a feeling the need to protect what's theirs.
Okay.
Um, and from that standpoint, learning that that child had went through a really, really traumatic background of family losing or having very important possessions taken away from them that really meant something to them. So
Absolutely.
always in a space of, I have to protect what's mine.
hmm
Don't touch it. You didn't ask me. Don't touch it. Don't look at it, else we're going to have a problem.
Right.
And becoming just that strongly defensive of those things. But it came from a place of, I feel like I always need to protect my stuff because I feel like my things or myself, I'm not safe.
Right. Right. And that's the thing. When they come through our doors, we don't know their trauma history or their trauma story. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so if we just react based on the behavior and not consider the fact that, like you said, something could have happened in my personal life that causes me to be protective of my things or else they will be taken away. So,
Mm-hmm.
it's just really important to be able to be in a space that you're going to look through a different lens when you're looking at this child's behavior and that you're going to ask that question. I wonder what happened to this child that's causing him or her to respond this way. So yeah, and that's not something that when you are working in these types of programs, all programs do not require that you have this training prior to working with children. They give you
Mm-hmm.
CPR and first aid. They make sure you can save their life if
Mm-hmm.
they're dying. But what
Mm-hmm.
about
Right,
their
right,
physical health? But what about their mental health? And so
right.
I honestly believe that this is something that should be a part of the onboarding process so that
Oh, yes, most definitely.
right? So that I have that background knowledge when I walk in the door because this could happen day one and you're not sure how to respond. But then they want to send you to a training about a year later, and you're like, "Oh, if I would have known this."
Right, right, exactly. If I would have known this when I walked in the door, didn't
Yes,
know.
yes, yes. I'm like, oh my goodness.
Right. So, for those individuals that may want to seek out more information about trauma informed care, or if you have organizations that want to seek out more information about trauma informed care to make their staff aware and how to best serve their students, what are some resources they could start looking into for their growth in this area?
Right. So I will tell you that trauma informed care is one of those buzzwords that have just kind of emerged in the past, maybe 15 years or so. It's one of those things where there is not a set manual that has come out and said every program has to get this manual and this is how you have to do it in order to become trauma informed, right? But two good resources when you are thinking about getting this for your organization is to look at the CDC, so the Center for Disease Control. They're one of those reputable sources that has a lot of information about becoming trauma informed, and they have like a framework that you can follow in order to become trauma informed. And SAMHSA, which is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. You know, there is no big binder book SOP that has come out that says, you know, this is the book that you follow and everybody do the same thing. But there are guiding principles when it comes to becoming trauma informed. And so if you could look into those resources and make sure that as you are going through those phases that you are considering those guiding principles. And there are 6 of them. And so we have to make sure that we are thinking about safety, number 1. And number 2, trustworthiness and transparency within the organization, that we are considering peer support, right? And then number 4, that we consider collaboration and mutuality. And number 5, empowerment and choice. And number 6, we cannot forget our cultural and our historical backgrounds and things as it relates to gender, right? So we just want to make sure that we're looking at those resources to give us the guiding principles. And then we do what's appropriate for our agency. And sometimes we're already doing things that are trauma informed, but we don't realize it. So by just doing an assessment of our program and just saying, okay, this is what we're doing right. You know, we've been trained. We know what it means to be trauma informed. This is what we're doing right. And so let's keep this, but then let's look at some other policies and procedures that we do at our agency that might need to be changed so that we are making sure that we're not, again, re-traumatizing individuals and making sure that they have the best experience.
I did have a follow-up question for the previous conversation that we had. So my question is, I know that we talked about engaging students that have, you know, those high emotions and they're in that fight mode. But what about your students that are more so in the flight mode? How do you begin to re-engage them to check on their well-being and kind of give them tools to re-engage and address the problem that may have caused them to be triggered?
Right. So when you talk about the flight mode, again, these are young people who, when they experience that trigger, they are wanting to move away from the threat, right? And so when you are prepared and you have planned for things like this, you have a space for them to go that is safe. So the thing is, you may not be able to stop them from wanting to get away from whatever the threat is, because you may not even know what the threat is. You don't even know what just happened. But when you are prepared and you are trauma informed, then you have a space for that person to go. And so, you know, for you as a professional to kind of guide them to that space and allow them time to sit there and regroup and practice those self-management skills, right? And just come into awareness of what's going on. Then you can prevent things from getting worse, but you want to give them that space and time to kind of do what they need to do in order to come back. And again, asking them the question, what is it that you need right now? And what is it that I can do?
Right.
Sometimes they just need a little bit of time. And then you ask them, they want to talk, you talk them through it. And then usually they'll be ready to come back once they can bring themselves down. So fight, flight, or freeze, they all look a little bit different, but the strategies are very similar. It's just recognizing which one that they're in and being able to give them that time and space, and then address what the situation is and ask them what they need, and then do what needs to be done. And then the other thing I want to say about this is that, which I'm not sure why it hasn't come up earlier, but to me, at the core of working in these programs is relationships. Relationships,
Yes.
relationships, relationships, right? You have that teacher that says, oh, when Johnny comes to my class, he's on 10 all the time when he's doing this. And another teacher talking about the same kid is like, oh, he's calm when he's here. He does fine. He does well, because he has a relationship with that individual and he feels safe in that space. And so in your, OST spaces, you want to make sure that you're creating relationships, establishing strong relationships with the kids, and that you have individual relationships with each of them. Or that if there is a student that experiences a lot of challenges, that there's one or two people in particular that are intentional about establishing a relationship with that young person. And in that way,
Right.
just by way of the relationship, it may help de-escalate the young person and have them be able to assess their situation and then self-regulate and come back to what's going on. So those relationships are everything, I tell you.
And they are. You can't address a child and not know who they are and what they're about, but then try to correct them before you know them. So that's important to know who's around you and what are they invested in. Like, what are their likes, what are their dislikes, and begin to build that rapport. And with that being said, it makes me think of mindfulness and
Absolutely.
how that can be used to deal with trauma informed care. So, how can mindfulness be used to kind of combat some of those things that you see for those students that may have gone through trauma?
Right. So I absolutely love mindfulness. I tell you, Janice. And it's so interesting that when I first found out about mindfulness, I was trying to teach it to my students, but I wasn't using it myself. Right. And
Mm,
so that's the first thing, that if mindfulness is something that we're going to use as a preventative measure and to kind of be ready so we don't have to get ready, we have to make sure that we buy into it, right? But just thinking about how information enters our bodies through our five senses, right? We
mm,
communicate with the world through our senses. And so when that information enters our body, it comes in through our nervous system and it comes up from the bottom of our brain first, and then it goes up to the top of our brain. And so when information is coming in, it has to pass through the amygdala first. And the amygdala is that part of your brain that senses the threat. And so if there's an event that happens and it comes in through the amygdala first and then it prompts a stress response, then it can't even travel to my front of my brain, my smart part, or my prefrontal cortex that says, you know, let's sit back and let's think rationally, right? It doesn't even get
right.
there. And so mindfulness is an awesome tool because it is maintaining a present moment awareness of our thoughts, our feelings, our bodily sensations, our environment, all those things that are coming in through those senses. And so it
Mm,
involves, accepting our thoughts and feelings without judging them. And so
mm,
practicing mindfulness helps with trauma because it calms the amygdala, right? And it allows us
mm,
to reconnect ourselves with our calm, clear prefrontal cortex, right? So we can
right.
calm that amygdala and say, you know what, this is not a threat. I am going to
Mm,
I'm going to stop. I'm going to breathe. I'm going to be in the
mm,
moment. I'm going to look at
mm,
my thoughts, my feelings, my bodily sensations without judgment. Just recognize that this is
mm,
happening right now. I'm not making any judgments. I'm just sitting in the moment and just recognizing where I am right now. And so practicing
right.
mindfulness is amazing because it puts a space between the event and the thoughts that you have about the event. So
Right.
if we don't use mindfulness and become present, then we have the event, we have a thought that comes up about the event, and then we go straight into our emotions, And if that emotion is negative, then we go straight into our behavior, which is usually negative, right? But if we are incorporating mindfulness, then that event happens. I recognize that this is a triggering event. So I make a conscious decision, right? I'm intentional about using those mindfulness skills that somebody in my program taught me, right? And
Mm-hmm,
so
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
then I can change my thought about the event, which then changes my emotions about the event. And then I respond in a better way. So, mindfulness is just awesome when it comes to just, again, self regulating and de escalating myself. And then helping young people understand that they are taking control of the situation, right? That depending on how they process this information, this situation can go left or it can go right. They have the option or the opportunity to choose,
Right.
right? And so when they know that, they can feel empowered that when situations arrive that are uncomfortable, that I can take control of the situation and I could just put myself in the present moment, take some deep breaths, do whatever it is that I need to do to bring myself down so that this ends well.
Okay. My last one for you is, how can OST professionals begin to incorporate mindfulness tactics into programming?
Right. So when we are incorporating something new and something this important, thinking about being trauma informed, we have to make sure, number one, that everybody is buying into this, right? We can't have the part-time professional who heard about mindfulness come in and start doing mindfulness, and then the supervisors are like, what's going on? What are we doing? We don't have time for that. So we have to make sure that we have buy-in from the top down, right? We have to have the support of leadership, and we have to make sure that when we incorporate mindfulness in our programs, that everyone is held accountable to do it. And so a great way to introduce mindfulness to whoever comes up with it, because like when I started working in prevention, I brought this to my team and I brought it to the leadership staff first. And so we started incorporating it into our leadership and our staff meetings, right? And professional development, we incorporated it. So now when we're in the program, sometimes out of nowhere, right before the program, if I sense that the vibe is not where it needs to be, I'm like, all right, y'all, let's do, some activity. I might bring in some essential oils and just pass them around and get everybody in their nice mood, right? Their nice flow.
Right.
And then you can create, once you do all that and you get everybody on board, then you can create a little binder with some ideas so that if you're the main person who's talking about mindfulness or doing the activities with the kids, that if you're not there, someone else can take your place and do that. Right. So just getting the staff on board is the first thing that we have to do. And then we want to introduce mindfulness to our participants in our program. We have to tell them about the brain and tell them about our survival brain, right? And our smart part. There's videos all over YouTube that talk about how to explain the functions of the brain to young people. So we want to make sure that they understand that. And then we want to teach them how to breathe. Like, who teaches us how to breathe? Right. And we're doing this shallow breathing, trying to get it together. We got to do belly breaths, right? We got to take it all the way down.
Right.
I see you, Janice, getting your belly breathing in, right? So we teach them, and then we start incorporating it daily, right? And so the staff may lead the activity, but then after a while, we get kids involved and make them a part of the process. And so we can do this right before our homework time or our tutorials. So it puts everybody at a nice, calm space so that they can do what they need to do without being tense or worried about anything. And then we have to make sure we share it with the parents and just let them know what we're doing at the program and give them some ideas of how to incorporate it at home. And the last thing I want to say about it is anything that requires your full attention and taps into your five senses can be mindful practice. Sometimes people think about mindfulness and they're thinking about being, crisscross applesauce sitting on a mat with their fingers touching, like meditation. Right? Yes, but mindfulness is more just being in the present moment, just making the choice to do that and doing it without judgment. So if I got to pull out my cha-cha slide or my Cupid shuffle, right, or my two-step, Hey, right? Or if I do some mindful eating or some mindful drinking or mindful walking, just stopping to read a book or looking at an object and just really, like, really intensely looking at it and thinking of, how it
Hmm.
looks, how it smells, how it sounds, how it feels, what it tastes like if it's something that you could taste. All those things are grounding, and it gets you to a space where, you can level out, calm down, and then you can move on with your day with
Right.
intention and
Right.
set yourself up for success. So I loved it. And I noticed a huge difference in my program once I started incorporating it. Kids were just calmer, and they all were part of creating that safe environment. And so I couldn't ask for anything more.
Woo woo! Well, that brings us to the end of our question section, Miss Yolanda. So we're going to roll into our Professionals Lounge. Professionals Lounge is a segment of the show that allows guests to share advice and tips with other practitioners in the OST and youth development fields about how they can begin to grow their gifts and talents, but also develop themselves as professionals in the field. My question for you for Professionals Lounge is, what advice would you give to young professionals that are starting out in this field of work?
Yes, ma'am. So we've been sitting here talking about trauma and being trauma informed, being preventative, and just being ready so you don't have to get ready. So the first thing I would say is to make sure that when you're coming into a space like this, that you are trauma informed. If your organization is not providing that, you can ask for it. And if they still aren't providing professional development in this area, then go out and do the research on your own. Look online for different resources just to find out how can I be proactive when it comes to working with young people who may have experienced trauma. And then probably just as important or more important, to be self-aware and to be self-managing for yourself and understanding that my experiences in my life matter as well. And I'm human. I'm not alone. I have some similar situations as the kids that I work with. And so I have to be aware of my own triggers and my own trauma and just be able to take time to process how this information applies to me. I would also say to put your oxygen mask on first, because they tell you on the plane you can't help the person next to you if you don't help yourself first. So definitely put your oxygen mask on, fill your cup, do that self-care. And then remember that relationships at the core of anything can be a game changer. One relationship impacts two lives. So just like you're impacting that young person, them showing up at their best self, that impacts you as well as a professional. So we want to do that. Expand our concept of safety and what safety means for different, taking the emotional temperature of the room when you're there. That person that came in the door and they didn't speak, they threw their bag down. They're like, where's my snack? They just want to go be by themselves. Okay, clearly something has gone on. So I need to be aware of that and make sure that I'm putting some attention to that. And just remember to keep safety and survival at the forefront, and knowing that the behaviors that you see may be a response to something that's going on and not them intentionally just trying to be defiant or non-compliant. We go again from what happened, from saying what's wrong with you to now saying what's happened to you. And if you can look at situations through that lens, then it's going to be a great experience for everybody involved.
Well, thank you, Miss Yolanda, for being on the show and dropping these pearls of wisdom on us, ma'am. I greatly appreciate you.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's such an important topic, so I would love to continue the conversation in any way you can think of. I'm there.
Oh, I got you, ma'am. I got you. So if anybody wanted to get in touch with you to find more information or incorporating mindfulness in their program, how do they get in touch with you? Go ahead and drop your information.
So you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Unbreakable Minds Coaching. I am also on Instagram, and I have a link tree which gives you some amazing links to different interviews and conversations that I've had. And my link tree is also Unbreakable Minds Coaching. All my information is in my bio on those platforms. So if you want any information about mindfulness, about trauma and being informed, or about youth life coaching services, y'all can hit me up.
Well, everyone, that brings us to the end of our show. I'd like to take this time to thank Ms. Yolanda Hall for being our guest today. This was a great conversation. I hope the audience got a chance to really soak in the information that you were giving, and hopefully you share this with someone that you feel can benefit from it. If you enjoyed this episode and feel you received some good information, give us a review on Apple Podcasts or visit the Podchaser website and leave us a comment. This will help us get some feedback on the show and collect testimonials for our personal website. Share us with your friends, share us with your family, share us with your network. Help us spread the word about how OST programs are impacting our youth and our communities. We can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Podcast Addict. Well, that's all I have for today, y'all. In the words of Mr. Arthur Ashe, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. Until next time, bye-bye.